Welcome to this podcast about steering committees. My guest is Jaap Stoppels. He is researching the behavior of steering committees. Jaap, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I'm a researcher at Delft University in the Netherlands for my PhD. I'm a PhD candidate, and my research is on project steering committees.
And looking to your research, you have a statement about what steering committees tend to do.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of them really struggle, the committee as a whole, but also the members. So why am I here as a member? What are my responsibilities and what are my authorities? To what degree should I know the project or the products of the projects? Just to clarify at the start, when I'm talking about steering committees, I mean a steering committee dedicated to a project or a program. Sometimes you also see that steering committees are portfolio boards, for example, which are more permanent. I'm not talking about that. It's about a temporary committee.
Temporary steering committees and not permanent steering committees. And looking to the reason, what causes, what drives you to start researching it?
Besides being a researcher, I'm also a project manager myself, and I saw several of those committees struggle. What you also see then when a project is in trouble, it's not just that the project team and the project manager are in trouble, they are struggling, but also the governance body, which is above it. Sometimes often it's a body like a committee. Sometimes it's also a single person, although that in my experience that's the exception. So they don't know what is their role, what should I do to make the goals of the project, how should I align these to the permanent goals of the permanent organization.
So in fact, it's what's their role and what's their position within
Yeah.
the steering committee. Is that all of the struggle, or could you elaborate more on struggling?
Now there are more. You also see both in practice, but also there's literature about it. If I talk about literature, I talk about scientific literature, by the way, that there is an information imbalance. Project managers typically know more than the steering committee members because it's their job and they have more time to spend on it. Um, and project managers might not report everything or might report too much. And then to a committee member, it might not be really clear what they have to do with this information. Can they still decide? Or is it more like something that happened in the past? So in the end, you could say, well, are those steering committees really in control? And do they really have to steer? Or are they a bit behind the ship and it's going somewhere and it's difficult for them to steer it?
Yeah, and if you're talking about behind the ship and not governing it well enough,
Mhm.
of course you have to have a view, a picture, model of what you're governing.
Yeah.
How about that in steering committees?
Yeah, it depends. If I look at project steering committee, I studied both project steering committees in civil engineering and in IT. But in both cases, often it's something you do as a member once or twice in your career. There are exceptions. If you are really a project based organization, it could be that the way of working, of delivering your products is via projects. Then it's easier because you're selected and probably trained on doing this kind of governance work. But often that's not the case. So you are in a committee typically because you have a certain function in the permanent organization. Perhaps I should explain that a little bit. What I see in the formation of a committee, that the project owner or the project manager, or perhaps together, are saying, well, this project has a certain value, has a certain risk, and it involves these kind of stakeholder groups. For example, if you're talking about an ERP implementation, it's a kind of big standard software involving all your business processes. Then okay, it involves operations department. It's really important. It's risky for the organization. Okay, so the person who has the function of operations director should be in this committee. Then this person is a certain person, a woman or man, gets asked to be in a committee. So they're not really selected based on their interest and not selected on the competences they have for this kind of job. So the assumption is that they are good in their daily job, and then they should also be good in their job as in governance and in support of a project.
Yeah, and looking to their role, is there some relationship with their responsibility and their results orientation? Could you elaborate something about that?
Well, of,
Because
of course, there is a relation because you're asked because you typically represent a certain stakeholder group. Could also be an alderman if you're talking about something in public works, for example, that you're in part of a city council. Um, so there is an overlap. You are responsible, in my example, for operations. So of course, you're really looking at the operations part of this project. But it's not that it's exactly the same, because, for example, in this case, IT capabilities will be changed, and perhaps you don't really understand what the products are which have to be delivered, or you don't understand what are the dynamics of these kind of projects. Probably you also have to agree on an overall goal for the project, which might not be optimal always for the responsibilities you have in this permanent organization. There might be conflicts there. That's not bad per se, but you have to be really clear about it that it will happen.
yeah, and if you look about this being together in a steering committee and sometimes accept things which are not all in the interest of your own stakeholders group.
Yeah.
What's their responsibility towards their stakeholders? Are they responsible to develop and, for example, the acceptance?
That really depends on what you agree upon in the steering committee.
So we have to agree upon that.
Yeah, and then you reach one of the larger topics I found, larger issues, that typically when the steering committee starts, you just start. There is a project manager who prepared a few sheets, for example, using the Prince2 roles. So we're going to do this and this. Then perhaps the project owner is going to say, oh, these are our overall goals. Do we all agree? Yes, we all agree. I know your project experience, but also in mine and what I saw in research, people typically agree on the overall goal on the level of a few sheets. Typically, they don't agree on the if you really going to determine what do these few sheets with the goals mean, and then they just start, and then you don't really know what are my responsibilities, what are my authorities, what are we going to do if there is a conflict between the responsibilities I have in the permanent organization, like my department, where I'm perhaps the head of a department, and for the project. Because typically there will be differences. I would even say that if there are no differences, you probably won't need a steering committee.
Yeah, and looking to one of the roles which I understand from my perspective is if I'm a member of a steering committee and I have to agree with something which is suboptimal for my own department, I have to take the responsibility for attuning with my stakeholders and getting the acceptance at the highest possible level.
Yeah, in what we call an engaged steering committee, that should be the case. But perhaps then I should elaborate a bit on what can be the goals of a steering committee, because you're touching one of them. If you look at the goals of a steering committee, there can be two, according to scientific literature and also what I saw in practice. The first is governance. If the risk for the organization is high when the project fails, you should have more governance. Governance takes time, takes money. So if there's a project which is really like we've done it so many times, if it goes wrong, well, we lose some money, it's irritating. But for the whole organization, it's not really a big drama. You might not need a lot of governance. If the other side, if the other thing is the case, you do need governance. And then governance consists of two parts. Providing direction. So in this case, you provide direction based on the overall goals of the owning or the funding organization. There could be several. So direction, often via decision making. And the second one is holding to account. This is based on the definition of the OECD. And then the holding to account is mainly towards the project manager, and that's on two aspects. One is on what you agreed upon, but what the project should achieve, like budget, typically budget, time, quality, but also on the conduct. So if I'm a project manager and what I do makes my project members they get ill because I push them too much, in most organizations that probably won't be acceptable. So there also has to be an hold to account on conduct. That's the first one, the governance. Then you have a second reason for a steering committee, which is support. If you have a project where there are tensions between stakeholder groups and you can't fulfill all their needs, then you need to have some support from the permanent organizations. Because then you can't solve it yourself as a project manager or as a single person who's the project owner, probably. Like in this example with ERP, what you typically see there is that the operations director wants to have more or less the same processes as now. There are some unique things for the organization, so they want to have some custom programming in the IT systems. If you are an IT director, that's not something you want, because then the maintenance will be more difficult. New releases will be more difficult, and it will cost more money. So it's a conflict of interest. That's something that really should be discussed on the steering committee level, and there should be some kinds of consensus or at least consent about what is the best for the overall organization. So that's the support part.
Yeah, and talking about the reason of having a steering committee, a risk for the organization, one of the things, but what I hear is also structure your steering committee according to the setting you're in.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's always something you custom make. What I see is that if I interview people, I interviewed a lot of steering committee members and project members, and then I never start with the Prince2 rules. Prince2 is the only project management methodology I know of which is quite clear about how a steering committee should be structured. Prince2, it's called the project board, for people who don't know it. And they say there are 3 roles. So, but even though I don't mention those roles, I hear people using them. The funny thing is that they use it often in different ways than meant by Prince2, but they need some kind of structure. So typically it's going to say, like I said, oh, this department will have to change or will be at risk. So we need to have somebody senior enough in this department who will be part of the steering committee. It could also be in civil engineering that you say, well, this is about improvement of dikes to prevent flooding of water. Okay, then those municipalities are involved. So we need to have the in Dutch wethouder of these municipalities. And also what you call in Dutch de gedeputeerde. So the person who is politically responsible from the provinces. We need to have them all together. They might also pay part of the money. And also in the latter case, they can't be overruled. You see, if you have steering committees inside organizations, then often the project owner is also the most senior in the permanent organization. That's an advantage. Because sometimes, well, you really don't agree. There are conflicts of interest. It's not bad, but it's just there. Then you could say, okay, then the project owner can decide. If you look at some of the civil works, the public works, that's not always the case. Let's say if somebody from a fire department from a really small municipality says, well, this and this is not allowed in our municipality during the project because it's not safe, then the others can't say, well, it's a project of 1 billion euros, it's only small, we take the risk. So then you really need a kind of consent of all the members which are affected by the decision.
Yeah, what strikes me is that in fact, you're mentioning that's my perception that when we talk as a project and program management about forming and storming teams,
Yeah,
we know a lot. So you have to form your steering committee and pay attention to the forming of the steering committee.
yeah, a good remark. Yeah,
And in fact, also making sense of it because, as you stated, using the role names but with another definition will give a Babylonic miscommunication. So
yeah,
you have to create steering committees in which people together make sense and create their truth for their situation.
exactly. What you do normally for every temporary team, you have those storming, norming, the Tuckman phases. You have some sessions together. What are overall goals? What are my responsibilities? What can I expect of the other people? How do I translate the goals to my responsibilities? That hardly ever happens in steering committees. Even organizations who have trainings for steering committee members hardly use them. The examples I saw of steering committee members getting training or coaching were were only in the case where the project was already in big trouble. So then there was a kind of renewal also of the steering committee, and they said, okay, let's start again, and let's start with some session. Why are we here? And then it helped, and they always said afterwards, oh, that was really useful. We should have done it before. I also asked my respondents, why don't you do it? I don't really know. We just start. We think we're senior enough. Should you have done it? Yes, we should have done it. But most of them don't do it.
Okay. And looking to, you already gave some tips for project and program managers, but could you add some more tips? Could you share with the listeners more tips for our profession?
Yeah, if you start, a few sheets about the Prince 2 roles really are not enough. So you really should find some means of involving them in what are the goals, what do they mean, what can I expect of a member, what can't I expect of a member if I'm a member. Um, it could be the Prince 2 kind of roles, but could also be for which departments. Let me give you an example. Um, I interviewed several people from a security project. And then one of the persons was responsible for the users part, so a big division of this research organization. But when he asked him for which divisions are responsible, he says, well, only this and this, the biggest one, where he was also part of the management team, but not the other two. If I asked the project manager and the project owner, they would say, well, this person is also responsible for the other two. And that gave some issues because they expected part of communication from the steering committee member, but he didn't agree, and it was never discussed explicitly up front. That would have helped because it would perhaps it might not change the situation, but then at least you know as a project manager that there is a gap in communication and that you have to do something. So tip one is make things explicit. Two is what I also see, what I often see is that the project manager is part of the formation of a steering committee, which is a bit strange because it's the committee you report to. You're not even formally a member. But I can also understand it because you have more time and you're probably more senior in this role than a lot of the members are. But if you do that, take care. The steering committee is not just for support towards your project, but it's also there for governance and even holding you to account. A third one, you already touched the topic. Make sure in the steering committee how your decision making will be. If I look at the tips of most of the more senior steering committee members, they say often formally in private organizations, public in companies, it's that it's a kind of advisory committee towards the project owner, sorry, the product owner, project owner. But in practice, it's a kind of consensus based decision making. But what the really experienced people say, no, it should not be consensus, it should be consent. What I mean by that, only get yourself involved if the topic, the decision really uh, is important for your responsibilities. And second, sometimes you don't have to agree, as long as you say, well, it's good enough for me. So that is the difference between consensus and consent. So from what I've seen, consent is the way to go. Be careful with consensus.
Because consensus could be suboptimal, or you could disturbing the process because it's not your piece of cake.
Yeah, what could happen if you don't have a strong project owner, that as one of my respondents referred to it, then he will be Santa Claus, Dutch Sinterklaas, because people all have, well, need this and I need this, and then we all combine it, and then it's a budget overrun, or it's not doable anymore with so many changes in the project.
Okay. Rewinding what you said is setting up forming the team and the duality of being a project manager reporting to, but also being involved.
Yeah.
Is that an suggestion that we should think about facilitating the setting up of the steering committee, not just doing it by yourself?
Perhaps if you're talking about we as IPMA, yes, but probably there won't be a lot of steering committee members following the advice. But yeah, given that project managers, but could also be senior PMOs, really influence what happens there, yeah, I think it's something that's missing. It's also lacking in the PMBOK, for example, and also in the IPMA competences. You only see it a little bit in Prince2. And I think it's strange because governance and support is really an important part of making the project a success, and not the triple constraints, but really the overall success for the owning or funding organization. So we really should involve governance and support in that via a steering committee or via other means.
Okay. Your research is still running.
Yeah.
And listeners could help you. How?
Well, at the moment, I'm searching for respondents for a survey about steering committees. I need a few hundred. So where this link to this podcast will be published, there will also be a link to the survey. If you are involved in a steering committee somewhere the last 2 years, and the steering committee is at least at least delivered some of the products, the end products, please fill in this survey or ask others to do that.
Okay.
That would be great.
How much time do I need to fill in the survey?
15 minutes. We really timed it.
So that's okay, 15 minutes. And you mentioned ask somebody else to do it. And I know that includes also steering committee members.
Yes. For me, they are hard to reach. Project managers are easier to reach.
So each project manager listening to this podcast could invite their steering committee members to fill in the survey, which is an intervention in itself, of course.
That's true. Yeah.
So it helps you as a project manager to create your steering committee because you're asking some things.
I totally agree.
Okay. Jaap, did we forget something which you would like to share now?
Not for this topic, but perhaps
okay.
for the next one.
Okay, for next podcast, you will be free to join us. And for now, Jaap, thanks for this podcast and good luck with your research. And listeners, please do help Jaap. Thank you.